turn it over to I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Barber, who is going to introduce Ben. And just thank you for joining us on this cloudy day and a little bit rainy. Tomorrow's going to be sunny, though. So, Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you.
As all of you know, an essential part of any holistic response to intimate partner violence includes working with the people who caused harm, helping them learn to implement and learn new ways of being in relationships safely. So I'm really thrilled today to introduce Ben as our presenter on one way of doing that. Ben is the founder of 3 Trees of Change, and after working as a mental health therapist in community and residential settings, he started 3 Trees at the end of 2007, and I think I've actually known him for pretty much that whole period of time. We met very early on. And he began developing cognitive behavioral inquiry method that drives his services. He's the co-author of the 3 Trees Center for Change CBI workbooks and co-host of the Harmful Habits podcast, which you can find through any podcast provider. So if you look on your iPhone, the podcast icon, you'll see it there. And that looks at a whole range of behaviors and experiences and how we can make positive change there. So I'm going to listen to the one on how to give up complaining later today, because that's something I might need some help with. Ben is the recipient of the Linda J. Allen Community Service Award for significant contributions that have brought honor and credit to the field of criminal justice. He has recently been working on developing CBI for the workplace and is also the author of the upcoming book, Turtle, Owl, and a Handful of Leaves, a guide to exploring your sense of self that is going to be released soon. So Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't have the comments open, so I'm trying to keep the screen kind of clear. So if just someone lets me know if there's something I need to address. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So feel free to shout out your questions. Feel free to call or text me afterwards. Feel free to email me afterwards. I'm happy to get back to you with any questions that you may have. What I would like us to do today is to really explore your own level of violence in your own life. And this may sound bizarre in the beginning. Hopefully it doesn't sound quite as bizarre by the end. But I really want you to just get a sense of how you might work through these own issues in your life. And then we can put them on a more extreme level with some of the offenders we work with to see how we can help them work on their issues. So let's just go ahead and get started. Hopefully my PowerPoint is working today. So what we're going to do is we'll go over a quick overview of the whole training. We're going to talk about static factors today and how to use them to predict risk. We're going to talk about stable dynamic factors, and these are really the treatment goals that you're going to be developing with people with violent behaviors. We'll talk about sexual violence and domestic violence today. And so if at any time it's unclear what type of violence I'm talking about, just be sure to ask. I'll be happy to help out. And then we're going to talk about acute dynamic factors, which are the case management portion of working with people who've engaged in violent behavior. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and to review that kind of thing. Anything we don't talk about today, don't panic. I think that's always a good rule of thumb. Just hold on to your questions. Feel free to email them to me in case I'm unable to answer them today. Like I said, I'm going to give you all sorts of contact information at the end. So whatever questions you may have, we can answer them at some point. So let's talk a little bit about what CBI is. CBI is what we use at 3 Trees. We developed it at 3 Trees, and it basically focuses on 3 trees of change. And these 3 trees are emotional resilience, cognitive consonance, and behavioral efficacy. So we feel that in order to create change in individuals and in ourselves and in communities and in organizations, that target audience has to increase their emotional resilience in order to manage difficult emotions. They have to increase their cognitive consonance to align their views with reality more effectively. And they have to increase their behavioral efficacy, which is to make sure their behaviors lead towards their goals. So the goal of CBI is to heal harmful habits and promote resilience and health. We currently have workbooks available for court-mandated clients, colleges, and also for workplaces. And I think it's good to mention too that CBI is rooted in trauma-informed approaches. And we also believe strongly that diversity, equity, inclusivity practices are 100% essential into working in violence prevention and intervention. And that perhaps this intersection between diversity, equity, inclusivity is often overlooked at how it intersects with violence prevention and intervention. Like I said, we're going to talk about these three factors, and they may sound a bit daunting at first, but all static means is stuff that doesn't change. I'm going to explain it in detail. And those of you who are note takers, take a deep breath, feel your shoulders drop a little bit, feel your chest rise and fall, and really tune into your body as we go through this training, and try not to let any stress creep in. We've got 2 hours to relax and to chat and to learn from each other. So let's see if we can make the most of it. If you're an avid note taker, just breathe. All these slides will be available to you afterwards, and I'll be available to you afterwards too. Stable dynamic risk factors, this is where we target for intervention. These are things that change a little bit and hopefully change a lot as you provide the intervention. And then the acute dynamic risk factors would be things that you address that can change quite quickly and change the outcomes of treatment. You're going to hear me repeating these terms over and over again, hoping that by the end of the 2 hours, they've really sunk in. So let's get started. We'll start with static risk factors and about understanding the assessment process. So static risk factors never change. An example of a static risk factor would be the age that an individual started engaging in harmful habits. And because they never change, you can do a lot of cool research on them. And you can say, okay, for everyone who started offending at age 8, what was the likelihood of then ending up in prison by age 21, et cetera. And so static risk factors have received a lot of attention, especially in the sex offending field. And in general, the sex offending field gives a much better, has much more detailed research in regards to these risk factors and how to apply them into risk assessment, et cetera. I think the domestic violence field has so much work to do in this area. But let's just start talking about static risk factors. So it could be the types of victims that they've had. So quick quiz, pull out pen and paper if you have it. Who would be more likely to reoffend? Someone who offended their own daughter, or someone who offended a boy that they did not know? So lock in your answers as much as you possibly can, and we'll come back to that question. Who would be more likely to reoffend? Someone who offended their own daughter, or someone who offended a boy that they did not know, a stranger? So because static risk factors are static, because they don't change, because these things have happened and therefore can't unhappen, they're excellent information for creating recidivism predictions. And from the recidivism prediction, you get a sense of risk. How likely is this individual to reoffend? What type of reoffending would they engage in? So let's come back to that question. For reasons that are going to become clear as we continue through this training, the person who offended their daughter is much less likely to reoffend than someone who offended a boy that they did not know. And we're going to talk more about that and why that is. And if that sounds surprising, I remember the first time I heard it, it was fairly surprising. And then as I learned about static risk factors and learned about stable dynamic factors, it made a lot more sense. So hopefully I'll remember to bring that up as we go through the training and refer back to it. Hope everyone's still keeping themselves calm and breathing deeply as we keep moving forward. So an important thing, I think, about offending in general is to develop a spectrum model of harmful habits. When I first started presenting on this stuff, it was probably like 2007, 2008, and I was often asked by the host organization not to mention females who have engaged in violent behavior. I was asked to focus on this always being a power dynamic and for there being no other reasons for offending. And that clashed with a lot of what I was seeing in the work I was doing, but also clashed with a lot of the research. And it's still a challenge for us to really get a spectrum sense of harmful behaviors. For example, do you consider yourself to be violent? And so sit with that question for a minute. You notice it's a very binary question. And 9 times out of 10, we're going to say, nope, I am not a violent individual. However, if we shift it to a spectrum-based model, I could say, what level of violence have you engaged in your life? And so immediately the floodgates open a little bit. And we're going to explore this in today's training. We're going to talk about this. But immediately it opens up to the possibility that perhaps there is not a black and white world. Perhaps there's not one group of individuals who are harmful and another group of individuals that are not. And this is uncomfortable, right? Because we don't like to think of ourselves in negative terms. The other area we see this is with racism. When you ask European Americans, are you racist? They will say no. But the reality is they're on a spectrum of racism just by being born into the inherent structures that we're born into. And so a much better question is, how have you worked on racist beliefs in your life? How have you become aware of this? How have you sought to disentangle yourself from racist beliefs and from racist privilege? And so as we start getting into this, we realize the spectrum model is far more effective for working on harmful views, and it's far more effective for working on harmful habits or harmful behaviors. And so that's the first invitation that I offer you today, is this invitation to see everyone you meet, including yourself, on a spectrum of violence. And obviously there's differences in intent, there's differences in intensity, there are differences in duration and frequency. But this is a really helpful model to start saying, everyone's on this spectrum somewhere. How are we working to decrease our level of violence in the world? And the beautiful thing about this is it means that everyone can grow. It means that everyone can change, with the exception of perhaps some sociopaths, and we'll cover that too. But it means that the change can occur. If we stick with this binary model, it kind of gives this idea that at some point people switch from being violent to not violent, rather than they can become less violent over the years. And people with lower levels of violence can therefore live in less restrictive environments, etc. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being someone who goes around murdering people, 0 being someone like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist philosopher and peace activist and poet, where would you score yourself on your level of violence? And we're going to give you some models to help you kind of ascertain a clear example. And then when you start working with people who are engaging in violent behavior, you'll be able to place them more accurately on this model too. And so as you move through the world and you're engaging with people, you can start to use this spectrum model to really understand how people are willing to go to different levels of violence depending on the situation, the environment, and other factors. I put the sex offender model down here because the sex offender model offers some great research to understand violence. It's not as present, as I mentioned previously, in the domestic violence work. And so even if you're in the domestic violence field and you're not in the sex offender field at all, I would recommend researching a lot of the research coming out of the sex offender field, because I think it provides some good information for any type of violence work. DV intervention, I think, still needs a ton of research. So there's some strengths to this spectrum model. By providing more detailed analysis of offending patterns, we can better respond. So if this person offends in this way, we can recognize that this intervention is more effective for that type of offending behavior. This intervention is more effective for that type of prevention, etc. And through having more effective responses, we can more effectively lower recidivism. And it's straightforward at this point. And the other thing is, one size does not fit all, no matter what the problem we're dealing with, no matter what the harmful habit. In the same way that we wouldn't refer a heroin addict to an alcohol education class, we need to make sure that the intervention fits the risk that the individual is providing to the community. But there are some challenges with differentiation. When we got started on this stuff, it was difficult just to convince people that domestic violence was an issue. And so creating a binary model and creating some clear guidelines around what domestic violence looked like was really helpful for educating people. People do not like complexity. It doesn't matter what the topic, be it the environment, be it race issues, be it crime, people really struggle with complexities. They like very simple answers. So the binary model meets that need, but at the risk of losing all the positives that we talked about in the last slide. So we have to be very careful with this spectrum model so that it's not a tool used by people to minimize their behaviors, and it's not used to undo the public education around domestic violence and sexual violence. So let's talk about your own level of violence. Let's say there's a scale 1 to 9, and I'm going to walk you through the scale to see where you're at. And I want you to think about where you typically go to when your power and control is challenged, but also the most extreme levels you've gone to when your power and control is challenged. So when your power and control is challenged, do you always, 100% of the time, no matter the situation, use assertive communication? Or under certain conditions, do you find yourself starting up to step 2 of the violence ladder, starting to use sarcasm, silent treatment? Now you notice sarcasm and silent treatment don't have much behavioral efficacy. Remember that third tree of change? Because when we use sarcasm and silent treatment, all we tend to do is create more frustration with the person that we're struggling with. And then if the sarcasm and silent treatment isn't helping them to see the wrongs that they've created in the world, and if they don't automatically fix it, we can then step up to using passive manipulation. So in passive manipulation, we may find ways to like not give them what they're looking for in order to give us what we think we need. And so any type of passive manipulation, we're moving up to level 3 of the violence ladder. Now, level 4, are you willing to shame and blame your partner, your children, your co-workers when they're not giving you what you want in life? Are you willing to point out their wrongdoings? Are you willing to go back 10 years and remind them about a time that was shameful for them in order to point out how they need to change rather than you need to change? Think back to the last argument you had with your partner and see if you used any shaming and blaming in that argument. Now notice we're already up to step 4 of the power and control ladder. So let's keep moving. Let's see how high we can go. Level 5, cussing and fussing. When you get into disagreements with family, with loved ones, are you willing to cuss and fuss? Here we're getting up to the kind of a legal threshold too, where law enforcement can become involved. When your level of power and control is challenged, do you start commanding and demanding people? Do you start telling them what they are going to do, what they're not going to do, when they're going to come home, when they can leave? We're getting up to a really intense level of domestic violence here, and yet you notice no physical violence has occurred yet. And level 7 is controlled physical violence. In between 6 and 7 are the stages where we start standing behind people, controlling their movement passively. And then we get into controlled physical violence, where we start putting our hands on people to control their movement or to hurt them. And then we get out into uncontrolled physical violence. So this is a scale we use in our domestic violence class quite a bit. And it helps both facilitators, bystanders, and participants in the program really get a sense of their own level of domestic violence. Going back a slide, what level of violence are you comfortable engaging in? What level of violence are you comfortable with your relationship getting to?
Ben, in the comments, there's a comment that says, don't forget microaggressions. So where would a microaggression fit in this ladder?
Yeah, so that would be a combination of the passive manipulation, shaming and blaming. And so you'll notice the intersection on racism and violence. From the 3 trees Center for Change perspective, violence is strongly intersected with racism and sexism. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we continue. But microaggressions, you're definitely up the level of violence. You're moving into stage 3, stage 4. And in some ways, these microaggressions just follow this level of power and control very clearly. When we get into workplace stuff with organizations, You see this very clearly, how people from the BIPOC community are victims of this ladder of power and control, and it's often authorized by the organization if the organization does not have a really clear diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging plan in place. So thank you for interrupting. Please continue to interrupt, because like I said, I don't have a view on the comments as I go through, so I appreciate that. So one of the ways we can look at domestic violence too is this categories of DV violence. When I first started in the field, I was told that men who are violent are just in one group. That's all there is. There's violent men, and they do it because of power. I think it was about 2013, 2014, I stumbled across Michael Johnson's work, and he believes that there's three categories. At the time, he believed there was three categories of violence. One is coercive controlling, which tends to be the model I was taught in, which is all about power and control, and that the person who's offending seeks to gain 100% control over the victim's life and uses violence to do so. The other type of category he saw was situational couple violence, where individuals had terrible coping skills, had high stresses in their life, and had real difficulty navigating conflict. And then a third category that he saw was violent resistance, which was when victims of violence decided to fight back in order to feel safe or in order to get to safety. So as he looked at the different types of individuals who were being arrested for domestic violence, he felt that they fit into these three categories. I believe in, there's probably like 8 or 9 different categories. I think our need for categorization, the human brain loves to categorize things, often oversimplifies things, but I think these are a great place to begin, to say, okay, the intention of domestic violence can vary. And if you're going to work with individuals, typically the only group you're going to have a lot of success with in a domestic violence program is that situational couple violence. And let's talk about why that would be. So the coercive controlling group is made up of psychopaths. These tend to be, and I'll talk about what you will typically see in victim services versus what you'll see in intervention services. But psychopaths, sociopaths, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Some people feel they're very different and that one's environmental and one's genetic, et cetera. I tend to use them interchangeably because I don't see a meaningful difference in how we talk about them. They're all diagnosed with the O'Hare checklist, and the person who developed that didn't see a meaningful difference. So if people love that debate about are there differences between psychopaths and sociopaths, I'm happy to engage in that offline, but I'm going to stay away from it for today. So when it comes to sociopaths, about 4% of Americans are predicted to be sociopaths. So we got what, like 200 people on this call. So it means we have probably about 8 sociopaths, psychopaths on the call. Now, if you add to that sociopaths and psychopaths love positions of control, like they love being lawyers, they love being counselors, they love being in law enforcement. Number one vocation for someone with sociopathy or psychopathy is actually CEO. But they're very attracted to these positions that intersect a lot with the field of violence too. So rather than having like 8 psychopaths on this call, we probably got more like 16 or 20 or something like that. Now look at the place of work where you work in, and think about how many people you work with, and you start to recognize like, oh hell, I probably work with a few psychopaths. And you may even have some names come to mind, but we'll stay away from that for today. But what you'll also recognize is that most psychopaths don't engage in violence. Psychopaths are individuals who do not feel emotions in the same way that the rest of us do. Their level of empathy is incredibly low, if not non-existent. Meaning that the only emotion they tend to experience is a very binary process of either they're winning and the excitement that comes from winning, or boredom. And so the only psychiatric condition that people don't really suffer is sociopathy or psychopathy. And we'll talk about why it's not in the DSM-2 and that kind of thing too. But this to me, it's fascinating. Like sociopaths and psychopaths, when they are not violent, they're just trying to win. And their definition of winning may seem incredibly petty to the rest of us. But what you'll see with sociopaths and psychopaths is a great ability to get you to like them. And you'll see them being very good at charming people. And you'll see them being incredibly good at lying and having no concern for the truth whatsoever, because the truth is just a tool that you can use to win or to lose. And so they're not bound by the same restraints that the rest of us are bound with. They're just trying to avoid boredom. And the way that they avoid boredom is by winning. Now, if violence is involved in that, then that's not an issue for the sociopath or the psychopath. But in general, the number of violent sociopaths is much lower than the total number of sociopaths. More so is this idea of winning. But let's intersect it a bit with the field of domestic violence. These individuals, you're not going to see as well represented in offender programs because they're typically not going to get arrested. They're going to be able to engage in domestic violence in a way that portrays them as the victim, that keeps them out of the legal system. And so they're probably going to be underrepresented in offender programs, but they're probably going to be overrepresented, or the victims will be more represented in victim service programs. And this is why, like, when I first began this work, there was like a rift between victim services and offender services that I'm not as aware of anymore. And it was because we were working with two different populations. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit when I talk about my experiences with Jada over at Safe Passage when she was at Safe Passage and the conversations we had about this. Now there's also, go ahead.
I apologize. There is a question in the chat that says, do psychopaths have narcissistic traits?
Yep, there's an intersection with like narcissistic personality disorder. We do a whole training on sociopaths, psychopaths. I'm going to try and stay away from it a bit today. So yeah, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, all the personality disorders can be represented in there. It's most closely aligned with antisocial personality disorder. The reason it's not in the DSM is because the person who wrote it had a falling out with the people who were editing the DSM back in the 70s. And so it just went two different ways. DSM uses antisocial personality disorder, but only 1/3 of inmates with APD meet or met definition for psychopathy when they did a study on this. So there is some overlap with all of those. The O'Hare checklist, though, is what we use to diagnose psychopaths. And so it's like a 30-point checklist, or and you take this to figure out how many of these characteristics are present. I got trained it a number of years ago. It's just not very, what's the word? It's not very practical to use in the community setting as perhaps it could be. So keep the questions coming, keep firing away. So we talk a little bit about female DV offenders. And Jada was the executive director over at Safe Passage, then Safe Homes. And when we met, she's like, Ben, why don't victim service organizations and offender service organizations get along very well? And so we started looking at this. And what we saw is that we had two different populations in front of us. The victims that she was seeing in victim services had offenders that we were not seeing in offender services, and vice versa. The individuals I was working with in offender services, Jada didn't get to interact with their victims very much. And then we started realizing that the research was equally split, depending on whether people use survey data or the FBI statistics. And so that's why when Jada and I were working together and supporting the work that each other was doing, we were very careful to start this differentiation purpose and really start to create more of a spectrum when it came to talking about offenders. So the question keeps coming up, do female engage in domestic violence? And I think if we go back to that spectrum model, it can be a really helpful model to say in what ways are females using violence and how can we support and care for them in ways where they're no longer using violence. But you notice there's that tendency to go back to that binary question of, are they violent, are they not violent? And then we can engage in conversations about how racism impacts that, how sexism impacts that. And we have all these different intersections that are very complex. And like we talked about, people are not always big fans of complexity. But I feel like the more complex your program becomes, the more effective it'll be in the long run. Sexual violence assessments typically use a lot of static factors. It's even in the names of a lot of sexual violence risk assessments, such as the static 99. Some sexual violence assessments are beginning to incorporate dynamic or stable dynamic factors into their risk assessment. So they're not only assessing the factors that happen prior to them coming into services, but they're also starting to assess how their personality traits are shifting, how the treatment targets are shifting during treatment. Static are the most accurate, static and dynamic are the second most accurate. Third most accurate is research-driven clinical assessments. The fourth, or the least effective type of assessment, is a clinical impression. I would encourage everyone to give up their own opinion about how well they know if someone's lying, or how they know if someone's a harmful individual or not. People are addicted to their kind of sense of self and their sense of importance. And as part of this, we all like to believe that we have the magic key to understanding when someone's lying. My daughter came home from school the other day and said her teacher was teaching them how to know if someone's lying. And it took everything in me not to send the teacher an email about it. That's not accurate. Like, none of those things are measures of people lying or not lying. So once you get to this reality of, I'm not going to know if someone's lying to me, then you can rely on data. Then you can go back to the information that you've received. Then you can go back to the static factors and stay away from your own opinion. I think that's just great advice in general, is not to take your own opinion quite so seriously. In the sex offending field, they also use biometric assessments to measure like how the body's changing in reaction to different types of audio or visual images, and attention-based assessments. Attention-based assessments are also coming quite prominent in the field of assessing implicit bias and things like that. And I think, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the biometric assessments. I'm sure they have their place, but I enjoy looking at the research around attention-based assessments and how they're being used in this field. Now, people often look at how mental health and substance abuse impacts violence. It is our belief that when the stable dynamic factors are already in place, mental health and substance abuse become acute dynamic factors that can make that worse, but they're not the cause of the problems in the first place. And hopefully that sentiment will make more sense by the end of the training. If I fail to do that, please challenge me on that. So the other way that we break up violence, especially with sexual violence, is it experimental or is it predatory? Now, experimental is what we tend to focus on in community treatment programs. So the best client for a community treatment sexual violence program is an experimental offender. They respond really well to correction. I think it's about, depending on the study you look at, it's somewhere between 8% and 15% of people in community treatment programs will reoffend. They tend to be opportunistic in planning, meaning there wasn't a plan, the opportunity arose, and they chose the harmful behavior in response to that opportunity. They tend to have age-appropriate fantasies that don't reflect the sexual violence they engaged in, and they experience shame and guilt around the behavior. Now, predatory, which is where we're moving on to the kind of sociopath, psychopath end of the spectrum, they'll have repeated offenses despite whatever intervention you give them. It's very difficult to treat them in the community, if at all possible. They tend to seek out victims. They tend to have strong deviant sexual fantasies and little to no empathy. So if you look at how the media talks about sexual violence, one of the things that we do really poorly is we tend to want to make it binary, because that's what people can understand and that's what people can palate. And so we tend to head towards the predatory type of sexual offending. So when I grew up, it was all about stranger danger, which wasn't helpful at all, because it didn't help me manage my environment and set myself up boundaries to keep myself safe around family members or friends or close family friends and things like that. So if we can shift to understanding the different levels of violence, we can really start to care for children well by helping to understand that we don't need to just be worried about strangers. We also need to be worried about who we expose our children to, who they're able to spend time with, what kind of supervision is present in those situations. How do we create safe supervision structures for our kids to interact with other people? Now, at the start of the training, I talked about whether an individual who'd offended their own daughter was more likely to reoffend versus someone who offended a boy that they did not know. Now that you have this model of experimental versus predatory, you can see that the individual who offended the boy that they did not know is probably more likely to offend. But this is kind of a shock, right? Because in our brains, we think, who would offend their own daughter? And this is why the spectrum approach helps us to understand the different types of offending, how people offend, why they offend, and based on the static risk factors, who's likely to reoffend, and how we can assign treatment responses or intervention responses based on that model. This is female sex offender types, and so, or female sex offender typology. The research on female sex offenders is very limited. I think females are much less likely to get caught due to some sexist biases in our culture. We don't tend to believe people when they're offended by females. We tend to be much more likely to think that the victim enjoyed the sexual violence when perpetrated by a female. They did a great study with the Australian police force where they took people from law enforcement from all over Australia, and they gave them the same case studies. The only thing they really shifted was the gender of the victim and the gender of the offender. And they asked them, when would you press charges? When would you not? And there was an incredibly strong bias that when it was a male offender, they would press charges very quickly. When there was a female offender and a male victim, they were very hesitant to look into pressing charges. And so this has to be worked through. But in general, with the data we have so far, there tend to be three types of female typologies when it comes to sexual violence. One is male coerced. And this is where an individual may be living with a partner, living with a husband, and he's the one with the deviant sexual behavior, and he's the one with the deviant sexual fantasies. And she feels like for her own safety, she needs to engage with him in offending other people. Here, the male is typically the instigator. The female, out of concerns for safety, etc., will go along with the plans. Another one is predisposed, and this kind of gets into more of what we talked about with the predatory type of offending. And then a category we tend to see with females that seems to be in the research more than it is with males is this teacher-lover model. And I think the most interesting thing about this teacher-lover model, or how they consider themselves a teacher-lover, obviously they're engaging in sexual violence, but for them is they often see nothing wrong with their behavior. No matter how much time they receive in prison, no matter how much people let them know, or no matter how young the victim is, they often hold on or maintain this idea that they were like a mentor for the boy that they were victimizing. And so those, once again, don't get caught in binary categories. Just have different tools available to help understand different types of harm and different types of violence. When it comes to juveniles, and we look at static factors, and we're looking at like how much pornography in the home they've been exposed to, how much domestic violence, and what type of boundaries in the home, people acting out sexual behavior, is there a lack of sex education, and extreme sexual views. This extreme sexual views is becoming more and more interesting to me. We notice that people who come from very strict religious backgrounds tend to have such strong boundaries around sex that they tend to see all sex as sinful, that they end up engaging in sexual behavior with people that they know will keep their sexual behavior quiet through threats and through violence. And so this is why we really need to help people move into the middle. So boundaries too tight can cause sexual offending. Boundaries too loose obviously causes sexual offending. And we need to make sure that people are getting some really good, healthy education around sex, around sexual development, around emotional development, and healthy boundaries that are necessary to manage those experiences. And here I just put on some red flags of juvenile sexual behavior. This is getting more into kind of case management stuff, but juveniles who are starting to engage in sexually harmful behavior will see typical gestures as sexual. So someone puts their hand in their shoulder, for them, they would interpret that through a sexual lens. A lot of their sexual experimentation will be done within a power imbalance where obviously they have more power than the other people. Because of that, they tend to seek out the company of younger children in private places. And they have a home life of inconsistent boundaries in terms of violence and sexual behavior. And so this is why the intersection of domestic violence and sexual violence is so high, and why sexism, racism intersects with those so highly too. And then knowledge of sexual behavior beyond that, which is age appropriate. So let's move into acute dynamic risk factors. You notice I skipped the stable dynamic risk factors because they're what I want to spend a lot of time on in the second hour. So acute dynamic risk factors aren't necessarily what we would manage in treatment. They are what we would manage through case management. And so acute dynamic risk factors are things that can very quickly derail treatment. So let's say I'm working with an individual and we're helping them make some good shifts and they're changing their stable dynamic factors. But if they suddenly have a relapse in their substance use, it can derail all their treatment. If something in their mental health shifts and they're experiencing a mental health episode, it can derail their treatment. And so this is why the case management is so important in working with these individuals, because the people providing the interventions, the case management, the victim services, the court services all need to be on the same page so that as these things are heard, like, hey, did you hear this happen in Johnny's life? Everyone can respond from their place of expertise. Vocational path is another really important one. If they lose a job, the likelihood of returning to harmful behavior goes up. If they start a new relationship or if they maintain a relationship with the victim, the risk of harmful behavior goes up. And so making sure that we manage all of these through the case management systems that we have in place. So case management should be a combination, like we talked about, of the courts, probation, victim advocates, PTI, the intervention providers themselves, trying to get as many people involved who are really focused on knowing what their role is, knowing what their strengths are, and also respecting the strengths of the other groups involved. And then having regular meetings that are structured, goal-oriented, rather than just kind of time to process. And the risk is that people get together and they all process who they think is lying to them on the model that we talked about previously, based on their own expertise and figuring out who's lying and that kind of thing. And that can be less effective than having really structured meetings where you're looking at these stable dynamic factors, these acute dynamic factors, and seeing whose risk of engaging in harmful behavior has increased and whose has decreased, and managing appropriately. In sexual violence as part of case management, we also use polygraphs. You have maintenance polygraphs, which over the last 6 months, has this individual been following the rules of the program? And the polygraph just helps ascertain that. You have incident polygraphs, which are did this thing occur or not occur on this specific date with this specific behavior. And then you have sexual history polygraphs, where people can get a detailed sexual history through a combination of polygraph and interview. And so those are an important part of case management. They're not a part of every sexual violence program due to finances and things like that, but they're really helpful and really important when possible.
And there's a question in the chat. It says, how do you prevent a male child from inappropriate actions with females, other sexual actions when the child was sexually abused?
One more time?
Yes. How do you prevent a male child from inappropriate actions with females, other sexual actions when the child was sexually abused?
So I don't know if you necessarily prevent, because that goes back to like a binary model, right? That sense of this happens or doesn't happen. I think you can decrease risk. Now you can prevent by preventing them from being around anyone else, but I think you can decrease risk by helping them understand and giving them some context for what happened to them, providing them some emotional regulation and some behavioral efficacy tools. And so that will probably be understood a bit more in the third part of the training. So the intervention you would do with someone who's at risk would be the same either way. And so if that question is not answered by the end, let me know and I'll go back and hopefully not blow it as badly. We will see. All right. So, I think I missed that part. So our intervention philosophy is that community safety is a top priority. In mental health counseling, the individual is the top priority. This is not mental health counseling. Mental health is one concern for us when it comes to acute dynamic needs, but this is not mental health counseling. In our interventions, community safety is a top priority. Most people who hurt other people can change and they can lead legal and safe lives, but we as intervention and case management specialists have to figure out when they cannot and have to try and make the most skillful decisions when we recognize they're not going to be able to do that. It's always important to use best practices, but monitor when it's working and not working. You'll hear like about an evidence-based practice that may have worked well for like people growing up in a village in England. That may not work in like North Florence, South Carolina. And so use best practices, but monitor what you're doing to make sure that what you're doing is working in the communities where you offer your services. We believe that the intervention is only one part of the overall management of people. And so you have to do this work as collectively as possible. And that creates obstacles. It's not always easy to get everyone in the same place at the same time. It's not always easy to get everyone to follow like this risk model. But as much as you can, any progress you make in those areas will be rewarded through an increased outcomes. And that people who harmed others need to be accountable for making progress. Too often we put them in like process groups where they sit around and talk about what they've done, and we like introduce a coping skill or something. And I don't think that's effective for them. I don't think it's safe for the victims involved. I don't think it's a great way for the court system to monitor progress. So we do believe in making sure that people are completing workbooks that demonstrate the types of changes that we're about to start talking about. All right, so is everyone ready to get into interventions? Anna, any other questions?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, let's get started. So interventions, we call these the 3 trees of change because we focus on emotional resilience, cognitive consonance, and behavioral efficacy. So that question that came up earlier about how do you work with someone who has been harmed, how do you care for them to make sure that they wouldn't go on to harm others? I don't think it's as clear cut as people who are hurt would be likely to go on to hurt others, but you can definitely use these 3 trees to look at what area might be best for them to work on. And during this training, all of you are going to work on these 3 areas to see what deficits you may have and to see where you would like to start working on your own life. The more you increase these 3 trees, the more healthy you'll become, the less harmful you'll become, the less likely to engage in any type of violent behavior. The more you work with the individuals who are in intervention programs with you, the more you work as an organization to increase emotional resilience, cognitive consonance, behavioral efficacy, the healthier you'll become. So let's get started with them. Things to remember. You have to be able to reflect these values in your own life. You cannot be the individual who is incredibly wise when it comes to theory, but within their own life is not engaging in these behaviors. So making sure that not only do you teach these to your group participants, but that you're also teaching these to the facilitators, that as a program you run based on these models. You're gonna need a pen and paper. So I'm kind of slowing down a little bit so people can gather a pen and paper. And as we go through some of this, and you cannot do this work well until you explore these issues in your own life. It is incredibly messy working with harmful behaviors. And if you do not continue on a daily basis to work on your own emotional resilience, your own cognitive consonance, and your own behavioral efficacy, it's going to become very messy work indeed, in which you may do more harm than good. So if everyone has pen and paper, let's get started. We're going to start by talking about ACEs. And for those of you, most people know about ACEs these days, but if you don't know, it's this adverse childhood experience study. This started back, I think it was like 1970s. There was a guy by the name of Dr. Felipe, and he worked at a weight loss clinic. And he was noticing, he worked with mainly older Caucasian people, and he was noticing that these middle to older age Caucasian males who were obese had a much higher level of trauma in their lives than other people. So he contacted the CDC, and they started a nationwide study that continues to this day. They continue to kind of replicate it. And they found that individuals who had a higher level of adverse childhood experiences tended to have future health issues. So you can build up your own score here. If this creates any kind of challenges for you, any kind of emotional difficulties, to stay away from it. But if you're curious, feel free. And we start by there's 10 factors on the screen. If any of those occurred to you before the age of 18, you get 1 point. And so everyone gets a score out of 10. And then based on that score, it's kind of like the static factors, we can predict what health outcomes you may experience later in life. Let me preface this by saying it's going to get worse before it gets better. meaning you're going to get a bit sad about some of the predictions, but then there's some positive news. That's helpful to remember. When my wife and I first started looking at ACEs, we were like, oh crap, we're screwed. Like we might as well go and write our will now and make sure the kids are taken care of, because it looked really negative. And then we started learning about some of the positive news that can negate the impact of that. So if you do start feeling a bit sad, hang in there. There's some good news coming too. Everyone had their score out of 10. What they found is that the higher your score, there was a dose-response relationship with the percentage of individuals who had ACE problems. So if you had one ACE score, 15%, two ACE score of 2, 25. And this dose-response relationship is kind of incredible. But you may be asking, what were those health problems? Well, one of them was the likelihood of using antidepressants later in life. And if you look at that 5 or more score, you start seeing how significant this impact is. Now, the mental health part of this made sense to me. I was like, sure, if you have higher levels of trauma as a child, you're naturally going to have more challenges working through difficult emotions as an adult. What I wasn't expecting was the physical health issues. So with a ACE score of 4 or more, you're more likely to have a ischemic heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes. And this is why my wife and I freaked the hell out, because we were like, oh my goodness, we're goners. And we had 2 young children at the time, and we still have them, sorry. We have 2 young children, and we're like, this isn't good. And so what we realized is there has to be some positives. And what research found, well, let me stay with the negatives for a little bit, sorry. If you have a score of 4 or more, you're 7 times more likely to go to prison. This means the individuals you're working with in community-based corrections and things like that are going to have a much higher ACE score. And the reason that they found this was, as you have adverse childhood experiences, it can disrupt your neurodevelopment. With disrupted neurodevelopment, you can have impairment in the way that you develop your socializing, your emotional abilities, and your cognitive abilities. As these impairments grow, you can be more likely to adopt high-risk behaviors or health risk behaviors to manage those problems. An example of this was my anxiety was incredibly high early in life. And so I used alcohol to manage that anxiety. Also found out later in life that I was neurodiverse on the autism spectrum. And I noticed at a young age, I started using alcohol to try to manage some of the issues that would develop for me socially and things like that. Now, if I had continued in that pattern, I'm then much more likely to develop disease, disability, and social problems, which can lead to early death. But the good news, I did promise there would be good news for those of you who do have a high ACE scores like my wife and myself, is resilience. Is that what we found is that even if you had a really high ACE score, if you have non-judgmental relationships in your life, if you have a non-judgmental relationship with yourself through prayer or through meditation, if you engage in physical exercise, and if you eat well, you develop both intervention and prevention for ACEs. Meaning, even if your ACE score is really high, you wouldn't experience the same negative health outcomes if you also had these factors in your life. So with the exception of maybe exercising, I think that's fair to say, my wife and I are now very focused on these non-judgmental relationships. And the other thing that we do is for our children, making sure we build non-judgmental relationships for them, modeling those non-judgmental relationships, and teaching them how to have non-judgmental relationships with themselves. This kind of goes hand in hand with gentle parenting, and it goes hand in hand with nonviolent communication, goes hand in hand with all the benefits we're seeing out of the mindfulness field. And so this is the good news, that no matter how high our ACEs score, through adopting some different behaviors, we can negate the impact of that score. So question 1, I don't know what you can see on my screen and what you can't, if you can see me or not, but anyway, write down some of the thoughts you have had as you heard this about ACEs, about how ACEs may have impacted your life and the lives of the people that you serve. So I'll give you a little time to work on that. About 10 seconds. Right, now, if you have this adverse childhood experiences, you may find that your F3, which we call the fight, flight, freeze, is much higher than it is for other people. So the fight, flight, freeze, or the sympathetic nervous system, is how your body responds to threat. So you're wandering through the woods and you hear like a crack of branches and your F3 kicks in, and suddenly your whole body shifts to be able to fight off that danger. So to either fight the danger, to run away from the danger, or to play dead, play possum and hope that it leaves you alone. So as part of this, your body is going to send all the kind of like the blood goes pumping to your muscles, your pupils dilate, your heart starts beating quicker, etc., so that you can run if you need to, or you can fight if you need to. But if you experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences, this can become your default. And so when I was like at the age of like 16 or so, and I remember drinking, and I remember thinking like, man, I wish I could feel this good normally. Because what was happening was the alcohol was artificially lowering my F3 into the relaxation response. But I had never felt that before because I stayed in this constant state of fight, flight, freeze. And so when I artificially triggered that into the relaxation response, I got to experience what most people kind of experience. I shouldn't say most people, because I don't know how many people really have a developed R2 these days, but I got to experience what people experience in the R2. Now, the purpose of the relaxation response is for your body to rest and to heal. So if you think about, let's say there's a gazelle wandering around. What do gazelles wander around? Like savannas, maybe? So let's say there's a gazelle wandering around the savannah, and the gazelle is jumping around, gets chased by some sort of predator, also savannah related, hopefully like a lion or something. And the gazelle gets away. The gazelle is automatically going to shift into its relaxation response. It's going to curl up in a ball in hopefully a safe place, and its body is going to rest and it's going to heal. So these two work like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. As one goes up, the other goes down. So if your F3 kicks in, if your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, your parasympathetic nervous system or your relaxation response is no longer functioning. So we're either triggered or we're relaxing, resting, healing. And the problem is, we've experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences, we are going to find ourselves constantly triggered, and our body's not able to rest, it's not able to relax, and it's not able to heal. So at the age of like 20, 21 or something, I learned about meditation, and I was able to trigger my R2 intentionally. And so through mindfulness practices, I was able to feel that rest, that relaxation, that healing intentionally. And that was a huge, powerful tool for me. It's one that I've continued to this day, because now as my fight, flight, freeze goes up, I'm more and more sensitive to it, and I can drop down into my relaxation response and slow down. A lot of us, as we go through the day, we get a bill and we call it a paper tiger because it sends our F3 through the roof. Or we get a call from our ex, and there's no real danger involved there, but it sends our fight, flight, freeze through the roof. Or we get on social media to quote unquote relax, and it sends our F3 through the roof as we see stuff that's happening in the world, injustices that are happening, or the fact that like the neighbors down the street are on vacation yet again, and it sends all these things and it gets translated as F3. Or we watch very dramatic shows on TV, and these things also trigger our F3. Even though we do them to quote unquote relax, we don't relax while we're watching these shows. They trigger our adrenaline and they keep that sense of danger up, and we feel, because it's controlled, it feels positive, but we get addicted to this adrenaline.
There are a couple of comments in the chat. So one is, all right, so having a high ACE score has led me to feel more in tune with understanding and more empathizing with others who are experiencing trauma. But I have to be careful not to allow the experiences of others to trigger my own past trauma memories and history. And then someone else said, my score was 4. My experiences have been both positive and negative on my life, mostly respecting boundaries. I must work on this so I don't go overboard in helping process or taking my clients' experiences as my own.
Yeah, and I think that's where that boundary work comes in. And I think both comments recognize that, was the sense of, okay, if I've been through these adverse childhood experiences, have I done the work necessarily to heal so that I can care for others well? And once again, it's not binary. It's not like I have healed or I haven't healed. It's like, how much have I healed? Have I healed enough to do this much work? Have I healed enough to do this kind of work? And so, yeah, I love that people are kind of checking this stuff out, growing, and learning the necessity of boundaries. So which of the two systems, this is question 2, do you and the people you serve function out of? How does this impact your work and your life? And if you have a few people from your organization attending this, like I noticed in the guest list, like some places have 5 or 6, feel free to kind of share this after the training and feel parts of this that feel safe to share with coworkers, and connect and have discussions about that. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the F3R2, we've talked about the trauma, and so now we're going to talk about what is emotional resilience. And to understand emotional resilience, we have to understand about how we manage emotions. So emotions, from our perspective, are considered the accelerator in the brain, meaning emotions push us away and pull us towards things that we either don't want to be around or do want to be around. As an example, think of the worst date you ever went on, and you're gonna kind of like cringe a little bit. And that is your body trying to push you away from that experience. Now, at the same time, think of your favorite food, and you're gonna notice that the emotions are gonna rise in your body, and they're gonna pull you towards that favorite food. Now, the issue is that the emotions often get things wrong. So my body is very attracted to high carb, high fat food. And so whenever I see like high carb, high fat food, especially like Indian food, I want to eat a lot of it, because over the years, this is how my genetics have learned to survive. And I have to be careful not to always allow my emotions to drive that car. I also, some of you may be able to look back at relationship choices you've made in the past, or fashion choices that you've made in the past, and you can see this thinking error of how often your emotions have led you in the wrong direction, perhaps. And that things that felt like, I absolutely need this outfit, were in retrospect not as wise as you may have hoped. And so to understand emotions, you have to understand that emotions lead us in the wrong directions a lot of times, and that you have to be very careful about which emotions you trust. Now, the braking system on emotions is our cognitive development, is our ability to process emotions through our cognitive development. But emotions, because of their place in the brain, are a lot stronger than our thoughts. You'll hear people, when they argue, state quote unquote logic or state the truth. What they're really stating is their emotions. And if you argue with someone about politics, or if you argue with them about religion, both sides at the end of the argument will feel stronger about their position, because they weren't looking to change their position anyhow. They were just strengthening their emotions by arguing about what they feel passionately about. But no one's willing to admit this isn't logical, this is emotional. And so we get caught in that bind. Now, if you happen to have some ice cubes handy in your house, you can run and grab them real quick, and you can practice by managing difficult emotions. Because if you're gonna grow, you have to be able to experience uncomfortable emotions, but you have to do it compassionately and thoughtfully. So many of us were raised in shame. Many of us were raised with a lot of negative emotions that don't really help lead us to growth. But if you're really gonna grow, and if you're really gonna make a dent in the generational trauma that was passed down to you, you're gonna have to learn how to sit lovingly, compassionately with difficult emotions. And one of the ways that you can do this is through holding ice cubes. Because if you sit there holding ice cubes, your brain's going to tell you some crazy stuff. Your brain's going to say, hey, if you hold these ice cubes, your hand's going to fall off. You're going to get hypothermia. Your brain's going to trigger that F3. You're going to feel like you're in danger. And then you're going to come up with some logic to justify that danger that really doesn't make any sense at all. So as you sit there with these ice cubes and you're holding these ice cubes and they start to melt, at some point you realize like, I'm not in any danger at all. And this is where we have to recognize the difference between being uncomfortable and being in danger. And so a lot of us, especially when it comes to issues of race, a lot of us European Americans, we're uncomfortable having these conversations, but we confuse it with being in danger. So we don't engage in these conversations as meaningfully as we could be. But if we learn to recognize what emotions are just uncomfortable rather than dangerous, we can sit and have conversations about race and about violence and about complexity in a much more meaningful way that helps those of us who are upholding these systems really start to deconstruct them. If you go, everyone on this training recognizes that if you go to a conference about violence against women, men are not very well represented at these conferences, yet we're overwhelmingly the people engaging in this violence. And if you try to talk about with men about violence towards women, you'll notice they'll quick to defend themselves and say, not every man, but yet all men are upholding these systems of violence by not willing to sit with the difficult emotions necessary to deconstruct these problems. And so one of the ways you can practice this each and every day, if you like, is through holding ice cubes. And what you'll realize is that over time, your brain will get more and more confident that this is not dangerous, it's just uncomfortable. And you can take that into different areas of growth in your life. If it's dangerous, back away, listen to your F3. If it's just uncomfortable, you can help your F3 slow down and recognize the necessity for you to sit lovingly, compassionately in this space. One of the ways I use this a lot is if someone's sharing a problem with me, I have the desire to fix it. And so if a family member, like if my partner or if my children are sharing problems with me, I sit and hold ice cubes because all they really want me to do is to listen and to sit next to them. And so that desire to fix things that seems to be genetic in me, I just learn to let be. I see the emotion telling me like, Ben, you should give some advice. They don't want any advice. They don't need any advice. And so I just sit with the ice cubes and allow that feeling to pass. And you can use this with all uncomfortable emotions that may be holding back your growth. So question 3, what are some of the most common emotions that trick you into harmful habits? What are the consequences of this?
And Ben, there were some responses to question 2, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Fire away.
So someone said, the experience of parental abandonment has led many of my clients seeking affirmation. This leads to multiple children born in one-parent homes. Thus, the cycle continues.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone responded that to question 2, that people are in crisis F3 all the way.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone else said, violent movies don't help our society, yet many are drawn to them.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that hero role that we love in our culture and why that creates a lot of problems. I love all that sharing. Some of the environments we work with, I'm going out to the West Coast in April just to help them set up a environment in a probation setting that will help for people who have high adverse childhood experiences. So that as soon as the people walk into this space, they can start triggering their R2 and intentionally lowering it. So by the time they have their communication with their supervision officer, what have you, it's done out of a place of F2 rather than R2 rather than F3. Because what often happens is when we're at F3, when we're at fight, flight, freeze, our ability to think clearly is incredibly harmed. And all we're able to do is react emotionally. So if we're ever going to have conversations with people about their behavior, if we're ever going to have conversations about changing behavior, it has to be done from a place of R2, it has to be done from a place of rest and relaxation. The other thing that we notice with individuals who engage in harmful behavior, and Tony Porter and the Man Box do a great job of breaking this down, is that we don't teach, especially boys, how to experience hurt and fear. So if we have, you can see this on the news even, men are very comfortable expressing anger. And if we have a client that comes into a class and he's very comfortable expressing anger, And if I say to him something like, man, you're an emotional individual, he's going to respond with something like F you. Because for him, hurt and fear are incredibly uncomfortable emotions. Growing up, hurt and fear were told as something to be avoided at all costs. And he was probably abused in some way for expressing any type of hurt and fear. However, men are very supportive of each other's anger. When the Dallas Cowboys lost recently, there was a video going around on social media that ESPN thought was really funny of men breaking their TVs. And they were putting it out there like, oh, look at these men breaking their TVs. They weren't paying attention to the children in the background crying and the level of violence that these men were expressing because their inability to really process hurt and fear. And we see this time and time again, that people get hurt because men are unable to process hurt and fear. And so we work with individuals in our programs on, if you're experiencing anger, this is a secondary emotion. The primary emotions that make up anger are hurt and fear. Until you start working through your hurt and fear, until you're able to sit with uncomfortable emotions, you're going to experience anger. Anger is going to make you very weak. Anger is going to make you very vulnerable. It's going to lead you to cause harm to people that you're saying that you care about. However, when we experience hurt and fear, we tend not to act it out in the same way. We tend to turn inwards. And I think that's why so many men choose anger, because it means that other people have to change rather than them change. And so you see this on the news all the time. People react very angrily to, I can't believe this is happening. And what they're really trying to say is, I'm hurt and afraid, but they won't ever admit that. So in this kind of work, you're going to have to help people learn how to identify emotions more effectively. You're going to have to teach a lot of emotional literacy, and then have to help them work through the hurt and fear that they're experiencing and how they can manage that. But a lot of men end up with one tool for every job. So wife wants to talk to them about the bills. They're afraid of financial problems, and so they respond with anger. Their partner wants to talk to them about problems in the relationship. They're afraid of their partner leaving them and hurt by that decision, so they use anger. And it just goes on and on. Whereas if we can teach them to manage hurt and fear well, for those individuals who have an interest in learning that, we can really help them develop a lot more strength. For you as an individual working with people who harm others, you have to be able to learn how to manage your hurt and fear. When you experience anger, you have to be able to translate that into the hurt and the fear that you're experiencing and how you're going to work on that.
There are some, I think, great comments in the chat. So someone said, I think in response to the men and their emotions, I'm not a pussy, right? So that may be a response someone would say. And then there's another comment, it's just a game, a temporary setback, a fleeting moment in time. Our relationships must be prioritized, not a football game.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is a question, is that all men or just some?
All men, all humans exist on that spectrum. We each have a responsibility to move ourselves down that spectrum to become more emotionally literate and less harmful. And so that's that binary again that is so persistent in our culture. Am I one of the good people? Am I one of the bad people? The way I would urge people to break through that is, if, let's say you're a European American individual and someone says, hey, I think you're racist, rather than responding with, no, I'm not, say, yeah, I probably am. I wonder how I could decrease that. I wonder how I could work on becoming less racist. And you'll notice immediately your emotions tell you, you do not want to do that. You do not want to start exploring, are you racist? Are you sexist? So when we work with European American males, we do a lot of this work around recognizing you're going to be on this spectrum. Until you recognize you're on this spectrum, you're going to cause harm. You'll have individuals who say things like, I don't see color, and that's incredibly harmful. And so how can we help them recognize that they do see color and that they have implicit bias based on that color, and then start moving down the spectrum? So I'm bringing these examples up so people can start seeing the intersection of thinking errors and emotional fragility, and how we can start working on that together. So hopefully people have had enough time to work on question 4. How well do you and the people you work with identify primary emotions? At the workplace, is it ever talked about? Do you process primary emotions? Or is it much more supported to convey emotions like anger? And if you work in workplaces where anger is very supported, hurt and fear are not, you may want to like get on Indeed or something and start checking out some other workplaces, because you're going to experience trauma in those work environments. So the last part of emotional resilience I want people to understand is just this kind of triune brain approach. That each person's brain starts by building the automatic, and this is like your body temperature, your heart rate, all that kind of stuff. Then the emotional functions build around that. And then lastly, the cognitive functions build around that. And they continue developing till about 24 or 28 if there wasn't any neurodevelopment from violence, substance use, etc. Now, the reason that this is important is your automatic functions are going to be prioritized over your emotional functions. Your emotional functions are going to be prioritized over your cognitive functions. So as soon as there's any challenges in the brain, the cognitive function is the first function to be given up. So as people get more frightened, as people get more hurt, their ability to think clearly gets decreased. And this is really important, because when you see like some of these individuals on TV, they're typically male and they have incredibly strong emotions about different topics, but they claim that it's all cognitive and logical. It's impossible. With the level of emotion that they're experiencing during those conversations, it's impossible for their brain to be functioning that way. They just learned some really quote unquote clever scripts. So if we're going to really help people change, we have to do so at the emotional level. That's what's really going to support change in individuals. People don't stop smoking because on their cigarette packets it says you're going to get lung cancer. People stop smoking when they have emotional experiences that show them the emotional importance of quitting it. So behavior change really happens at this emotional level. It will then lead to cognitive changes to support that change in emotions, but it's really important to be aware of this kind of priorities. Body temperature, heartbeat, that's going to be your first priority. Secondly is the emotions that you experience the world with. And then lastly is this ability to kind of think through and think logically about problems. So do you tend to use logic or emotion to connect with people and yourself? This is a challenge for me. Like I mentioned that I'm neuroatypical, and I only just realized this after my son got diagnosed. And then the doctor who diagnosed him recommended I get I get tested. And so I went through the process myself, and I realized how much I often distance myself from experiences in order to keep myself safe. And so I've had to engage in a lot of work on really recognizing how important emotion is in relationships for other people. So there's a lot of strengths to the way that I interpret the world, but one of the challenges is I may not always do a very good job recognizing the emotional state of other people. And so it's really important for me to kind of focus on the emotional cues that I receive, and to not always kind of go to logic and not always try to provide a logical explanation, but to try to really create a relational connection with humans. For me, that's exhausting and leads me to be very introverted. And I think having a sense of that for yourself too. If you can only do this for 5 minutes a day, make sure you're only doing this for 5 minutes a day so you don't get burnt out. But really understanding the way that you connect to people. Any questions there, Anna?
Yes, there are several questions in the chat. So someone said not allowed to vent, and I think that may have been a response to either how men are socialized or how they deal with emotions in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Someone said we don't discuss personal anger or emotions, but we staff our cases with the supervisor. Mm-hmm. Someone else said it's not a priority at work, though coworkers may vent in private with one another. Mm-hmm. And there was a question in the question and answer that says men usually blame others when they feel hurt and shame, and their negative behaviors feel justified in their mind frame.
Yep. And I think this is why I tend to gravitate towards workplaces that are run by women, because men are very emotionally fragile. And I know even me saying that is going to cause maybe some sort of challenges in the in the comment section. But because men have only been taught about anger, they tend to really struggle to process emotions well. Whereas women have kind of had full range of these emotions and do a much better job processing them and are much stronger because of it. But that is a vast generalization. I'm trying to stay away from binaries. I think it's really imperative that men do a lot of work on their emotional intelligence so that it doesn't end up causing harm to other people. So question 5, do you tend to use logic or emotion to connect with your people in yourself? Whenever I ask male leaders this, like, I'm a logical individual, I only use logic. And it's like, you don't. You have all this emotional bias. You have all this kind of perception of yourself. And so men get very tied up, and I'm male, so that it's kind of like the only perspective I know really, but get very tied up in their sense of self. And if anyone below them in any way challenges their sense of self, they don't know how to process hurt and fear, so it becomes anger, which they then take out on those individuals, hence the unsafe work environment. So the second tree of change is cognitive consonance. And cognitive consonance just means seeing the world as it is. So if you've ever been drinking and thinking you were doing a great job on the dance floor, and the next day someone shows you some videotape and you realize that you have no rhythm at all, that would be a lack of cognitive consonance. Cognitive consonance means your ability to see things in a way that attune with reality. The first one is the binary versus spectrum thinking. The world does not exist in binaries. As much as people like myself who are neurotypical would love it to be a binary universe, it is not. It is very spectrum based. And we have to start understanding problems based on spectrums rather than binary. We shouldn't be saying, am I violent or am I not violent? We should be saying, how violent am I? Those of us who are Caucasian, we should be saying, am I racist? Am I not racist? We should be saying, how racist? Those of us who are men, not am I sexist? Am I not sexist? But how sexist am I? When we start understanding issues in this way, we make much more progress, because then the next question can be, how would I like to decrease that? How would I like to start working on whatever level I may be at? So question 6, and I'm going to let my dog out real quick, but how often do you maintain a spectrum approach to yours and other people's issues? And how does this impact your work? So how often when you staff cases, do they get talked about in a spectrum? It's one of the things I love about the autism spectrum. There's obviously some challenges with it, but it's like a lot of mental health issues exist on this spectrum, but we tend to create this box of you're either this or you're not this. And I know that makes it easier for billing companies and things like that, but I think it has some challenge with really reflecting reality well.
There are some really great comments in the chat again.
Keep
So
going.
in the question 5, someone answered, I try to use logic eventually, though I usually get hit with the emotion first. It's exhausting to let emotions rule. It wears you out. And someone said, just for laughs, but that was the Philadelphia Eagles fan, not Dallas Cowboys. Us Cowboys fans accept our lost well, LOL. Someone else said, yes, all my male bosses have been emotionally fragile. Thank you for acknowledging that tendency. And then someone said, I am the only male working with 3 females. Sophia, I agree. I am emotionally fragile. I take a step back. Driving to my clients allows me time to take deep breaths and be mindful of how to proceed with each case.
Yeah, that's great. And sorry to the Philadelphia Eagles fan for their loss. And then obviously, right, you have the increase in domestic violence around big sporting events, be it soccer, cricket, rugby, football, whatever. Whenever there's a big sporting event, violence towards women occurs at a higher level because of this fragility. So cognitive consonance number 2, the drama cycle. So a lot of the people who engage in violence, well, all of us really engage in this drama cycle. So all of our movies, all of our music are filled with these 3 characters. Look at any Marvel movie. Just think of your favorite Marvel movie, your favorite Mel Gibson movie, and there's a hero that is all powerful. And the hero has the ability to rescue, to protect the victim. The victim has 0 power in these situations. The victim is dependent upon the hero for their safety. And then the third character is the offender. And the offender is the person who's harming the victim that the hero needs to protect the victim from. Now, when these are told in movies, they're considered very static in that the hero is a separate role and never becomes the victim. The victim is a separate role. It never becomes the hero or the offender. And that the offender is a separate role and that they're just innately bad. And this goes back to that binary model, right? That someone's either innately bad or innately good. Heroes are seen as innately good. They're often seen as white males in the movies that we have in America. And the offenders are often seen as male, but typically people of color. If you go back, look through movies and things like that, you'll see it time and time again. Victims are often depicted as female, as having no power and being reliant on the kind of fight between these heroes and these offenders. In reality, males and females play all three of these roles at the same time. And the more likely we are to play the hero role, the more likely we are to play the victim role and the offender role. So let me give you an example. Let's say I am vacuuming the house, and then my partner gets home, and I'm thinking to myself, I am an amazing partner. I'm an amazing dad. I can't believe I chose to vacuum the house today. And even though it took me an hour to find the vacuum. So all sorts of sexist tropes involved in that example, right? Now, let's say I feel that way. Then my partner comes home. She says, hey, Ben, it looks like you vacuumed, but you didn't vacuum everywhere. All of a sudden, because of my expectations I had as a hero to be worshipped by the powerless victim in this situation, and that they should have celebrated me and they should have congratulated me on what an amazing individual I am, I'm going to start feeling like the victim role. I'm going to start feeling powerless about the negative emotions that I feel. I'm then going to move into the offender role and start saying some stupid stuff to my wife. At the minute that she hears that, she's going to then fall into the victim role of why the hell is he talking to me like this? And then she's going to start saying some stupid stuff back. And before long, we're going to start spinning in this cycle. Now, the next day, if I go to work and I'm sharing with a coworker how unreasonable my wife was the day before, if he doesn't support me in my victim role, I'm going to now feel like a victim of his too. And now I've got two drama cycles going on. And then I go find a third person who helps me recognize what a hero I was and what a victim I was when these people didn't appreciate me or join my narrative. And it goes on and on and on. With the people we work with in terms of domestic violence and sexual violence, we see these played out to a much higher degree. And the offending behavior obviously is the behavior that moves up that power and control ladder. But the minute you engage in shaming and blaming, you are playing the offender role. So the minute you kind of resort to this passive behavior, you are playing this offender role. And so the goal is to only do things for other people when you can do so without having expectations. If it feels like it would be impossible for you to be in a relationship and not have expectations for the other person around their behavior, then it's probably not a good idea to be in a relationship at this time. Now, this doesn't mean that you have expectations for yourself. For example, one of my expectations for myself is that I'm in a relationship that doesn't have cussing and yelling. I can only control my part of that. If my partner were to choose to engage in behavior that was cussing and yelling, it's not that I try to change that, it's I recognize that I'm choosing a relationship where my behavior, when the other person's behavior is crossing a boundary that I have. It's not their responsibility to fix their behavior, it's not their responsibility to change their behavior, it's my responsibility to seek out a new relationship that reflects the boundaries that I have for relationships. And this is very difficult because it is entrenched in our society. Look at any love song. It's like, I can't live without you. I can't, get through the day without you. And that's incredibly unhealthy. I love my wife dearly. I love raising our children with her. And I need to be in a healthy relationship. And if there's behaviors that are happening that are preventing that relationship from being healthy, we have to be able to address those in a safe way. But if you get caught up in this person couldn't live without me, I couldn't live without them, you start cycling through this hero, victim, offender role. If you feel like you're a hero to the clients you work with, you're going to cycle through this hero, victim, offender role. And then when the client drops out of care, when the client no longer wants services, etc., you're going to feel like they've done something to you, rather than they were just engaging in the behavior that shape their life in order to keep themselves safe. And so, especially in the field that we're in working with individuals, we have to be very careful not to get into these roles with other people. And as soon as we identify that we're getting into the hero role by thinking we can fix, rescue, save other people, or we're getting into the victim role where we're holding other people accountable for the things that we're feeling, or we're getting into the offender role where we're punishing other people, we're shaming and blaming other people for what they've made us feel, then we have to stop, make sure we engage our rest, relaxation, our R2, until that slows down our emotions, until we can think more clearly. And if it's happening in a repeated way, then we may need to change that relationship or change that workplace. So
Then there's a really great, there's a comment and a question. So the comment is, when we react with an emotional response or physical response, we become the other person. We must refrain from immediate emotional responses. Think about what our actions and behavior could result in.
Exactly.
And then there's a really great question. It says, if society refuses to accept hurt and fear in men, how do they change or learn to handle emotions?
Yeah, we have to create much better education efforts around helping men identify hurt and fear. And it's like anything else. They have a lot of the power in society, so they're not hurt by their inability to not manage hurt and fear in the same way that people who are racist aren't impacted by their ability, by their racism. Other people have to pay the price for it. And so like anything else, men need to get together and recognize the harm that this is doing. For all the men out there who are saying things like, I would die for my family, like, you don't have to. You just have to learn how to manage hurt and fear better. Very few dads have to ever die for their family, but we do need to learn how to manage our hurt and fear well, because that's a really crucial skill and contributing and supporting to a healthy family. And so I love all that. Like, I think one of the frustrations people have is they start seeing the enormity of the problem and why we still have so much violence in our culture.
And there's kind of a follow-up comment to that, which I think works not just with misogyny, but with other kinds of problematic thoughts. Someone said, we as women also have to identify the internalized misogyny that has been ingrained in us.
Yep.
Someone said, how do you suggest helping people see their emotional responses as an emotional backlash and not the actual issue?
Can you repeat that last question, sorry?
Yeah, sorry, I talk fast. So how do you suggest helping people see their emotional response as an emotional backlash and not the actual issue?
I think you can point out cognitive dissonance. So as an example, let's say a guy comes to class and he says something like, I would die for my kids. And I can ask him, have you ever had to die for your kids? And he's like, no. I'm like, can you start being nice to the mother of your children? He says, no. And then I can help him explore how his emotions prevent him from doing what he really needs to do to be a good dad and to care for his kids well. So a lot of the men who are engaging in harmful behaviors still feel like they're great dads. And so I can use that to anchor that dissonance and help it as a motivational tool to increase their consonance. And I think you can do that in general, but it's very difficult because people are so attached to their sense of self and this binary sense of self, like I'm a good person. And I wish people would shift to more like, I would like to become a good person, or I'd like to become a better person even, and get away from this binary language. But yeah, you see it permeate through every part of culture, so it can feel overwhelming. And that's when you have to go back and meditate more so you don't get too distressed. But yes. So cognitive consonance, foxes, and chickens. So if any of you have kept chickens before, you know that you have to put up a fence around them to keep the foxes out and the chickens in. I am going to guess what your 5 chickens are. Chickens are the most important things in your life. So I want you to list the top 5 most important aspects of your life. It could be something like your work. It could be something like your family. Don't name individual people. And I'm going to guess what your top 5 chickens are. So take about 30 seconds and write down the top 5 most important things in your life. And Anna, we have till 12 o'clock, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And while everyone's writing, I want to point something out in the chat. These dynamics take place in LGBTQ relationships. Zoctrum and non-binary. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that S word correctly. But yeah, absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that. These dynamics can happen in all kinds of relationships.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I've probably been using very biased language in terms of relationships. So most people have the same top 5 priorities in their life. And they tend to be like groups or categories. So the first one tends to be something like family. So if you have some sort of word on there that represents family to you, that would tend to be the first one. The second one tends to be something around health, like their physical health. The third one tends to be something around their vocation, money, education, some sort of category that has to do with their work life and their financial life. The fourth one tends to be something around faith, spirituality, and these aren't in order. Some people obviously order them differently. But the fourth one tends to have something to do with your faith or your spirituality. And the fifth one tends to be something to do with freedom. For some people, it's hobbies. For other people, it's other things. So Anna, perhaps you can tell me if anyone has anything outside of those 5 chickens?
I think it's a lot of really similar things. Someone put music, health, rest. Someone put themselves. Someone put pets, resilience, comfort. Someone put their culture.
And so let's talk a little bit about, if we all value the same 5 things, why don't we all have them? And the answer, of course, is the foxes. And there are both internal and external foxes. So internal foxes are things that about the way we process the world that prevent us from maintaining these. So if I really like using cocaine, and so that's one of my chickens, and I really like being free and not being incarcerated, and that's one of my chickens, they're not going to live together. One of them is going to eat the other one. And so the first thing we have to do is make sure there's internal harmony between our 5 chickens. The second thing we have to do is to make sure that we're honest, that our behaviors match with these chickens. So if I say my most important relationship is with my children and my wife, but I'm playing Call of Duty every night for 3 hours, and I've only spent 30 minutes with my partner and my children, then actually my relationship with Call of Duty, online gaming or whatever, would be a bigger chicken than my relationship with my family. And so we have to check for that internal fox too, where we're not even being honest with ourselves about what our chickens are. And then there are external foxes. And external foxes will, without our ability to kind of really protect our chickens, are the forces, the external forces that seek to take our chickens away. These can be things like racism, it can be things like sexism, it can be power structures that prevent us from really protecting our chickens well. So you'll hear individuals say stuff like, why don't people pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And what they're saying is, why doesn't everyone have the 5 chickens I have? And the answer is because we don't all have the same foxes. We don't all have the same pressures trying to take these things that are important to us away. So the idea of like different types of relationships being out there came up. Because I'm married to a female, I get a lot of privileges around that help keep my chickens safe. For people who are in same-sex marriages, they face a lot more threat than I do. Because I'm a European American, I face a lot of privilege from that. The only area that I may not, of the many different areas that kind of lead to keeping your chickens safe, is my neurodiversity sometimes makes it difficult for me to interact with people who are neurotypical. That might be the only area of my life where it's a bit challenging to protect my chickens. And so we have to understand rather than telling clients that we work with, why don't you just do better? Or why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? We really have to understand the external foxes that are taking these things from them that they really value. And it's not helpful to just tell them to do a better job of protecting their chickens. We really have to understand this dynamic and see it from their perspective. We can help them with their internal internal foxes, like we can help them see how their behaviors don't align with protecting these things, but we also have to be very clear about these external foxes. Any questions there, Anna?
No, just a lot of more people listing their 5 chickens.
Yeah, they tend to fall into the same places.
Yes.
And this is a great way to set boundaries with other people. Like in my head, one of the needs I have is I cannot be physically standing close to people. And when people like try to hug me or what have you, my F3 goes through the roof. And so I can protect my chickens by verbalizing some of these boundaries and by setting some of these boundaries. And you can protect your chickens, like if it's Thanksgiving time and you've got family coming and you know after 2 hours they're gonna be driving you crazy, only schedule that time for 2 hours. Like think about how you protect your chickens consciously and then set the boundaries up appropriately. One of the challenges we have is that people get upset as we set these boundaries. And that's just another fox. So like if we go to a family reunion, things get a bit wild when people start drinking and the sun goes down. And so we always leave before that happens. And then family says, why don't you ever hang out longer? Because people don't always respect you setting the boundaries to keep your chickens safe. So one of the things that you have to do, one of the boundaries you have to build is making sure your focus is on your chickens, because no one else is really going to care whether you have your chickens or not. And so I think that's a really important part of this. And it sounds comical, but I'm often thinking about my chickens and if I'm caring for them or not. So question 8, how often do your daily behaviors match what your stated priorities or chickens are? And how do you help clients identify their foxes and chickens and their required behavior to keep them safe? The other thing that we work with on one of the treatment or intervention focuses for people engaging in harmful behavior is to help them develop that internal locus of control. So locus of control just means where they feel control of their life coming from. And we really help clients to understand the parts they have control over, like their emotions, their thinking, their behaviors, and to let go of trying to control the external factors. So they cannot control if they're in a relationship with someone who doesn't handle finances well. They cannot control how that person manages finances. They cannot control how that person engages socially. What they can control is setting up those red flags ahead of time and building relationships slowly and looking out for those types of red flags and responding to the red flags effectively when they see those concerns. So this idea of what can we control, what can we not control, very well kind of reflected in the Serenity Prayer of just making sure clients understand that and that they're only really going to protect their chickens when they have a good sense of what they can control and what they can't control. I used to teach this like you can have control of your response to everything. And I think that's a bit extreme and a bit binary. But I do think we can typically control a lot more than we think we can. And we tend to play the victim role when we're focused on controlling things that we have no control over. So the question here is, why do you think the ideal locus of control is and why? Do you think it's complete internal locus of control? Do you think it's complete external locus of control? Do you think it's in the middle? Do you think it's somewhere in between the middle and one of the extremes? And how do you encourage this with people you work with? How do you encourage them to take control over what they can versus what they cannot? All right, and then the last part of the second tree of change of cognitive consonance is just really challenging their thinking errors. So when they're using denial, when they're using externalizing, when they're using justifying and lying, making sure to just straight up challenge these things and say, hey, that sounds like denial to me. Let me explain why I think that. Let me explain why your emotions are going to kick in while I challenge your denial. Let me help you lower your emotions as we process denial and so that you can think more clearly about this. But all of these are attempts to protect chickens that really don't protect the chickens at all. They make them more vulnerable. And so helping people decrease the F3, develop a strong R2 so they can see clearly, so they can become more comfortable with uncomfortable emotions, and they can start recognizing what they control, what they don't, and choosing wisely. Which leads to the last question for the second tree of change. How do you compassionately challenge the thinking areas of yourself and others? Most people use a lot of shame, and they shame themselves, they shame others. A lot of us grew up in very shame-based cultures around sexuality, around fear and hurt and things like this. And as a consequence of that, we tend to use shame in our supervision. We tend to use shame in our commentary about other people to police people to get back in line with community standards. So moving away from shame, how do you compassionately challenge the thinking areas of yourself and others? Right, so the last tree of change is behavioral efficacy. And like we talked about, this just means aligning your behaviors with your goals. There are 3 steps in changing behavior. Sometimes people use like 5 steps. They use the pre-contemplated, contemplated, planning, action, relapse, etc. We tend to use these 3 steps because clients tend to understand it more easily. And so we just use rock, paper, scissors. Rock means that you're in denial. There's no movement at all. You're cold, and just until the pain of your behavior increases enough, you're not going to make any change at all. And anything that happens because of the behavior you're engaging in, you're going to blame it on other people. So that's the rock stage. Paper stage is where you start writing down your ideas. I don't know why I have toilet roll up there. That's probably not best. It should be like a writing piece of paper. But you start writing down your ideas. You start planning. Maybe use toilet roll for that. Who knows? And you start looking at what you want to change, what resources you have. And then the last stage is scissors, where you cut out the old behavior and replace it with a new behavior. This replacement idea is going to be really important when it comes to theories of change. A lot of us, let's say we're trying to quit smoking, we'll just quit smoking without replacing that behavior, and that leads to relapse. And I'm going to explain why in just a second. But get familiar with these 3 stages: rock, paper, scissors, and what they reflect in client behavior, what they reflect in your own behavior, and how do you help yourself and the people you supervise move from the rock to the paper stage? How do you move them from the paper to the scissor stage? Because if you don't help move them skillfully, the rock beats scissors and they're going to go back to denial. So how do you skillfully, carefully move yourself and the people you supervise through each stage of change?
And while people are thinking about that, there's a comment and a question in the chat. Someone says, when cultural differences come up in a conversation, I tell my clients that the white man is to blame for many atrocities and oppression against minorities. Today, we must strive to respect all people because everyone has value and deserves respect. And then there's a question that says, the person who says, I know I am not better than him or her, but I'm going to act as though I am, is that consonance or dissonance?
I know I'm not better than him or her, but I'm going to act like I am. I guess I don't understand that. Can the person who wrote it reword it? Like, why would you act that way if you didn't think you were? But Anna, feel free to answer it too. I'm probably missing something.
I guess someone that knows they're not better than other people, but acts like they are better, would that be consonance or dissonance?
So it would be dissonance. I mean, there's all sorts of dissonance there, right? Like, why would you be acting that way if you didn't think that way? Would be one of the types of dissonance. And the second would be, why act that way? Is it getting you the goals you want? Like, what type of goals are you hoping to achieve? So I think there's multiple layers of dissonance in there. But I might be missing something. That's why I was saying, if I have completely misunderstood the question, just to rewrite it, and then I can see my error.
I think you understood that question right, from what I understood.
Okay. So replacement behaviors. This is why it's so important in the scissor stage that it gets replaced with something. So A stands for antecedent, or what was happening before the behavior choice, and C is the consequence of it. So let's say after work, So antecedent is leaving work. The behavior is I go to the bar and drink with friends. And the consequence is I feel relaxed and I feel connected to people around me. So I need to write each of those down in their separate categories. Antecedent, leaving work. B, going to the bar and drinking with friends. And then C, the consequence is I feel emotionally connected and relaxed. Now, whenever you change behavior, you can't just get rid of it, the B. You have to find something that fits in that slot that matches the antecedent and matches the consequence. So if I were to pick, after I get off work, I'm going to go running with this running club I found. That may not initially give me the same consequence because I may feel awkward in the beginning, but over a few weeks' time, that may give me that same feeling of relaxation and connection, and I can do it as soon as I get off work. So this is kind of how we make replacement behaviors stick, is by fitting them into the step-by-step approach of you can't just remove the behavior. So let's use another example. Let's say I find myself shaming my wife when we have a disagreement and I get a feeling of like, I won that. I could then, when I have a disagreement with my wife, recognizing that, I could replace it by triggering intentionally my R2, breathing slowly, listening to her. And then as I listen to her and understand her problem better and we resolve it well, I'm going to have a much more fulfilling sense of feeling good about myself. Another example would be, I'm a good parent. Okay, so let me replace this behavior, which isn't really helping me become a good parent. It's actually putting that at risk, with this behavior to really solidify this feeling even more. And so when you're working with people on replacing behaviors, and more importantly, when you're working with yourself, because your clients will only really be helped by you engaging in these behaviors yourself, you really want to make sure that you replace the B with something that fits into the pattern of A and C. And you'll know if you're able to do that because you can ask yourself, when you fall back into relapse, what do you tend to do? Or when the people you supervise relapse, is it different, the same, or why? Or how often do you relapse? How often are you successful in changing behaviors? And once again, don't fall into this trap of morality. Don't fall into this trap of, it's because I'm a terrible person. My second grade teacher was right. Just recognize it's this replacement theory. If you're adhering to replacement theory, the change is more likely to stick. If it hasn't stuck yet, you may not be accounting for all the factors in the replacement theory, and it just requires a bit more work. So many of us get caught up in this trap of morality rather than kind of focusing on what is it we're really trying to achieve here and getting out of our heads with this I'm a terrible person stuff, which is just connected back to that shame and everything else. Right? Behavioral efficacy. The other thing to know about aligning your behaviors with your goals is developing a red, yellow, green. In our culture, we talk a lot about red flags. So green is when everything's just going well. Yellow is when we need to address some concerns. Red is when we have to get out of the situation. And this can be both situational, but it can also be long-term. So for example, if my internet wasn't working at the start of this training, or if we were having some issues with the internet, that would be a yellow flag. And I would need to then pull up another computer or something, or quickly drive somewhere else that has a computer I can use to address that. But what a lot of us do is we completely ignore the yellow light, and we just use this binary approach of green light and red light. This is good, this is bad. This is good, this is bad. But all the magic is in that yellow light. All the ability to say, oh, there's a small problem here, let me address it. So on Wednesday nights, my wife works till about 10 o'clock. And so when she comes home, she's super tired. And so knowing these things, knowing that on Wednesday nights, that it is really helpful for me to be loving, supportive, compassionate, because at that time she is wore out from working. Then we can address these things very kindly and compassionately. If we wait for the red light, if we wait to kind of point out how the other person is behaving and that kind of stuff, and if we're just focused on winning, then situationally, these problems are going to keep emerging in our lives. If you know that talking about finances with your partner is a difficult one, that whenever you talk about finances with your partner, there's a lot more stress involved, then it means that before you start talking about finances, how are the two of you relaxing and addressing that together, rather than just allowing that stress to be there and then turn into a disagreement. We use in my family, we use the passive kind of behavior, the silent treatment, things like that, is the yellow light that something needs to be cared for. So if one of us is engaging in that type of behavior, either the kids or my partner or myself, we tend to then say, okay, how do we skillfully, thoughtfully, carefully care for this so that it doesn't move up into a higher level of behavior on the pound control. So how do you help yourself and the people you supervise identify and manage yellow lights? And Anna, feel free to share any comments or questions.
Yeah, so the person that asked about the consonance or dissonance, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, they said question answered, thanks. And then there's a lot of, I guess, feelings about the comment about cultural differences. A lot of people are saying, wow, you know, oh my, someone said that they feel like they're taking a left turn. And I do just want to acknowledge that there's all kinds of feelings around that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if we have time to really dive into that, but I do want to acknowledge those comments.
Yeah, when strong feelings come up for me, I tend to, what a great opportunity, right, for us to practice that F3R2 stuff. And so if someone makes a comment that I strongly disagree with, I'm not necessarily responsible for that comment at all. And so what I can do is I can breathe and I can move into my body. And as that emotion passes, I can then kind of think about, is this someone who's going to have an impact on my life and that I have to skillfully navigate this? Or is this someone who won't have an impact on my life? In terms of this, in terms of them being part of a training, and I think the comment was something about that all of these problems come from this, then I think that's something that they should be comfortable sharing and then be open to the feedback that other people have. And that's the whole point of what we've been talking about today, is that people have such strong emotional reactions to things that we struggle to talk about things. And so rather than seeing ourselves as right and other people as wrong, we can see these things as just different perspectives. And because it's just an open conversation today, where we don't have to decide anybody being right or wrong or anything like that, we can say this is the conclusion that one person has arrived to. Now, in terms of myself, I can really only explain the opinions I have. The challenge for me comes from when those opinions start impacting systems and how those systems then start really hurting marginalized individuals. Now, the statement was also made in regards to a client, like when I work with clients, and in that situation, I'd be more curious about the client's belief system than my own. So I don't know if that responds to it in the way you are helping, Anna, but that tends to be my process when I hear things that may contain a lot of emotion.
Thank you for that. I think it's just important, like you said, to acknowledge that this does intersect with the work that we do and what we've been talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the discussion is going to become even more tense over the next 10 years or so as we really start to navigate how do these things impact the field of interpersonal violence. I think there's a lot of discussion to be had around that. And as people involved in this field, we're going to have to develop a lot of emotional tolerance for difficult conversations. And I think that's really necessary. All right, behavioral efficacy number 4, the car of experience. And this kind of leads into what we're talking about there. So picture a car, and this comes out of choice theory, William Glass's work. And picture a car, the front 2 wheels are your thoughts and your actions. The back 2 wheels are your feelings and your biological experience. And a lot of us, the cars should be front wheel drive, like you turn the wheels, it goes the direction that you want to go. But a lot of us drive with our feelings and our biophysical response. So let me give you an example. Let's say I hear a comment during the training and I find myself super angry. So those are my emotions and my biophysical response, right? That starts driving the car. And then my emotions tell me they're wrong. And my biophysical response starts triggering the F3, my fight, flight, freeze. And so I see that there's an enemy to be defeated and that I need to defeat the person who made this comment and prove them that they're wrong. That's all the back wheel stuff. And if you allow the back wheels to drive, then we just crash. Our cars just crash into each other. But our front two wheels are our thoughts and our actions, and they control the direction that the back two wheels go. And so my front two wheels, I might say in my thoughts, like, it's one person's perspective in a training with over 200 people in it. And we're bound to have a wide diversity of views. And isn't it nice that people feel safe sharing different perspectives? And then my actions can be consciously breathing and allowing my shoulders to go up to my ears, allowing my shoulders to drop down. And you can do this with me right now. And just allow, like, enhancing your shoulders moving up, your shoulders moving down. And you may find that your back two wheels go in the same direction as your thoughts and your actions. So when my wife and I aren't communicating very well, the first thing I'll do is go meditate or go for a walk. And that for me is enough of an intervention in thoughts and actions to shift my feelings and my biophysical response to the point where I can care for her skillfully and lovingly. If I don't do those things, then my emotions start driving the car and they start driving my thoughts and actions. So whether we are working with people or whether we're the people who need to do the work on ourselves, the car of experience is a really helpful model on how we can slow ourselves down, how we can shift from the F3 to the R2 so that we can gain some behavioral efficacy. So at the end of the day, our behaviors align with our goals. One of my goals is to be a very supportive, thoughtful, and kind partner and parent. And so if my behaviors are not aligning with that, I really need to kind of use the car of experience to help them align more effectively and to protect my chickens. Anna, any questions or comments?
Yes, someone said that your response was great and they sent their gratitude, there's more gratitude. And then someone else said, changing someone's behavior or your own is very difficult. Sometimes I wonder if it is even possible without years of work. We don't usually get that much time with clients.
So with that last statement, you notice there's always like an end goal in mind. Like when we say change, we mean from this behavior to that behavior rather than along a spectrum. And so I think we have to be careful with how, like, making sure we look at change as a spectrum. Are we interested in what kind of change? What are we hoping to achieve? And this is going to sound maybe a bit insane, but when we work with clients, we really shouldn't have any expectations about their level of change, because then we get caught up in that hero, victim, offender stuff and we get burnt out very quickly. I think Sarah will agree with me. We've both been in this field for a long, long time. And if you're not careful, you'll get very burnt out. We've seen a lot of people come and go, both on the victim service side of it and on the offender side of it. And you have to be very careful in managing your own emotional resilience. And this kind of bleeds into question 14 a little bit. Do you use a lot of compassion with yourself, with the people you supervise? Why or why not? And so what is your self-compassion practice? How do you offer this to other people? COVID was very difficult for me, both from an organizational perspective in the work we do, from a personal perspective, in family members who experienced COVID and their health issues. And I realized I wasn't always taking great care of myself during COVID. And it really was a reminder to regain or re-engage in that self-compassion work. I just noticed the time too, so let me get to the last slide. One of the ways you can check this stuff out is using healthy habits or harmful habits. Healthy, accepting, supporting, encouraging; harmful, shaming, blaming, and criticizing. This is like a quick checklist to your relationships with other people. Stick to the ones on the left. Accepting doesn't mean you're okay with it. Accepting means you recognize the reality of it. So the example we often use is, if I come home and my wife's cheating, accepting doesn't mean I'm like, hey, that's wonderful, great job, I'm glad you're happy. Accepting means I recognize that my relationship has drastically changed from what it was prior to me walking in. And that by accepting that and by supporting myself and the people involved and by encouraging myself and the people involved, I'm more likely to have much healthier outcomes than using the list on the right. So I'm going to skip over this. Those are 3 trees of change. You can receive the slides. If you want to stay in touch with us, website 3treescenterforchange.com, Instagram 3treeschange, Tickety Talk, no longer Three Trees Change. It's called Healing Harmful Habits. So you can join us there. I just forgot to change it in that. We do a lot of stuff on diversity, equity, inclusivity on TikTok. And the podcast is the Harmful Habits Podcast, and you can feel free to listen in there. Sorry for going over there, Anna.
No problem. There's just a lot of comments of gratitude in the chat. I think people really appreciate this information and this really, the other side of the coin of the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So just a lot of gratitude and more VSP numbers in the chat.
Yes, and Ben, thank you so much, because it gives us tools for our own self-care in this process and growth, as well as ways to work with clients. So just very appreciative
Likewise.
to everything you've shared.
All right, and feel free if you have any questions just to get in touch with us, go to the website, you can email us, and we're happy to help out.
And I'm going to stop.
Yes, we will be sharing these slides out, so just